Welcome everyone to this hybrid EU side event co-organized by OECD, IEA, New Climate Institute, Climate Analytics, UNEP-DTU Partnership, and GGGI. And also welcome to all of you here in Glasgow, as well as the online participants wherever you are. The topic of today's event are the important considerations for how to operationalize Article 6.4 mechanism, such as options for CDM activity transition, overall mitigation in global emissions, determining a share of proceeds for adaptation, and how to build capacity for implementation in countries. We will have a lot of technical terms here, but I'm sure you're a very qualified audience. But we have an excellent panel here to introduce you to the topics from the organizing institutions, which will be followed by some reflections from a discussant representing the LDC chair, and we will also try to allow for questions from the audience here in Glasgow or online if possible via the live chat, moderated by Kristen from OECD. There will be a recording of the session available on the EU homepage platform after the event as well. So with these first words of introduction, I would like to certainly just introduce our speakers that will present one by one. We have Luca Lorey from the International Energy Agency, International Climate Analyst. We have Jane Ellis from OECD, Head of International Climate. And we have Karen Olsen, the Senior Researcher on Article 6 from UNEP-DTU Partnership. And then I hope we have Harry Fernoff online from New Climate Institute. Yes, there you are. Very good to see you online. And later we will invite also one of our discussants representing the LDC chair, Gebru Endelov, at the end here from Ethiopia, also working for GGGI, but advising the LDC chair here at Glasgow. So with those words, I would like to welcome the first speakers, Luca Lorey, and followed by Jane Ellis. Go ahead, please.
Perfect. If I could please have the slides. And thanks very much, Suzanne, for the kind introduction. In this presentation, I'm going to highlight a few key takeaways of a paper that Jane Ellis and myself have published earlier this year through the OECD and IEA Climate Change Aspect Group, focusing on implementing the Article 6.4 mechanism, and especially focusing on the design options and the role of the host parties in the possible transition of CDM activities. Here is an outline of our presentation. So first, we're going to have a look at the actors that could be involved in the possible transition of eligible CDM activities to Article 6.4 mechanism. Then we have a suggestion for high-level criteria to guide the process for the possible transition. And then I'm going to provide a presentation on the assessment of few of the options that we analyzed. And then I'll turn it over to Jane to discuss the role of the host parties in the possible transition, and also the possible tasks that the host party would have for the activities before some concluding thoughts. So let me start by saying that the Paris Agreement is silent on the possible transition of CDM activities to the Article 6.4 activities, and parties are still to decide whether or not CDM activities can transition to the Article 6.4 mechanism, and under which condition. Actually, right this morning, for those of you who follow Article 6, there was a discussion about it in the room, so it's still very open. But if parties will agree on a possible transition of CDM activities to the Article 6.4 mechanism, it is important to understand there is a number of actors that are going to be involved in this transition. And as you can see from these very complicated slides, you have actors that span on different UNFCCC climate regimes. So you have actors that are from the CDM, so under the Kyoto Protocol, actors that will be under the Article 6.4 mechanism, so under the Paris Agreement. And then you also have other actors that can help in the process, for instance, the SAPSTA, the SBI, and the UNFCCC Secretariat as well. Some of these actors can take official decisions, such as the CMP and the CMA. Some others instead can elaborate recommendations, such as SAPSTA, SBI, or the UNFCCC Secretariat. Others can make choices, such as the host parties, and others can only implement the official decisions, such as the DNAs. And so, if this transition is going to happen, Jane and I suggested some high-level criteria that we hope the parties could take into account to guide the process of this possible transition. And these are 5 simple criteria. The first one is to ensure the coordination across these 2 different UNFCCC regimes between the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement. And so ensuring that basically the CMP and the CMA have coordinated decisions going forward, starting from here at COP26. The second criterion is on optimizing regulatory efficiency. The transition could take time, and so the more efficient the better, to start with a quick start for the Article 6.4 mechanism. And then there are some, it could be useful also to minimize the administrative and monetary burden on the project participants of the transition activities and the administrative burden for host parties. These are criterion 3 and 4. And then the last criterion is the compatibility with paragraphs 37B, D, and F that basically discuss, recommend that the rules, modalities, and procedure for Article 6.4 would allow emission reductions to be additional, and also that the process would take into account the lesson learned from the CDM and the Kyoto Protocol more generally. And so we, in our paper, we had a look at different elements, because the transition is also it's going to have different elements to analyze. And so we look at some key questions, one of which is, and then we map them through these criteria. So one of these questions is, which existing eligible CDM activities can a host party approve to transition, and how to do so? And so we came up with 3 options. One is a blanket assessment, so developing criteria that would be applicable to all activities. Another is a group assessment that is instead only for certain groups of activities, for instance, certain sectoral activities, and another is case by case, so project by project. And as you can see from the slide, of course, this is qualitative analysis, but basically there is no silver bullet. Some options would be more efficient from a procedural point of view, but there might be a risk that they're not compatible with the other paragraphs of the accompanying decision of the Paris Agreement. And then another question is, for instance, how to request and communicate the host party approval. And in the case, we see 2 options. One is that the DNA provides the approval letter only to the approved activities already, or that the project participants instead will be the ones that will require and send the approval request to the host parties. And as you can see in this case, the assessment is a little bit more clear-cut, but it's not always the case, and I'll leave it to Jane to discuss the nuances.
Thank you very much. So yes, this part of the presentation will focus on the role of the host party, which is really fundamental in Article 6.4. So the first issue that the host party is going to decide is whether it's going to participate in Article 6.4 or not. And this isn't really, this is not going to be a straightforward decision, because now all host parties have NDCs that they're aiming to achieve, which obviously wasn't the case under the CDM. So there are many issues that a host party will need to think about. So is it going to establish any domestic criteria for participation in Article 6.4? For example, a cost floor. Some countries did this under the CDM. What domestic processes is it going to set up to approve activities and authorize international transfers? Who is going to do what? And is it going to have any? Is it going to set any domestic standards that are supplemental to what has been agreed internationally to strengthen any international rules? So obviously, any country that participates in Article 6.4 will have to abide by what's agreed internationally, but it's possible for it to go beyond that and strengthen things domestically if it wants to. So we think that the answer actually to these questions is going to vary very widely by country because there are going to be different contexts for different host countries. Then there's some countries with only a handful of CDM projects. There's a few countries with 1,000. So the number that could transition, the number of potential new 6.4 projects will vary very widely by country, as does the form, coverage and stringency of the NDC. So yes, I apologize for these slides, which aren't animatable. So this shows a flow diagram of some of the tasks that are needed in terms of the actors and standards. And so if you start at the left-hand side, for example, under actors, that a country would need first to establish bodies to undertake the relevant tasks, and then it could designate a national authority. Anything that's out in this slide and the next slide that's outlined in a dashed line means that it could be started already now before we have agreement. Hopefully agreement won't be too long, but you'll see later that there will be some aspects that need a CMA agreement in order to start on it. So one thing that I wanted to highlight here, which is that although it's quite if you look at the middle line, which talks about the host party activities, this is about the same as in the CDM, that it's going to need to define and allocate responsibilities, establish processes, to assess and then to approve. But there's a key difference here, and that's outlined in red, and that is that in order to assess something, a proposed activity properly, proposed new activity or a proposed activity that's going to transition, the host party will need quantitative information on on how many credits are going to be transferred and when, because that will have a big impact if there's corresponding adjustments on its ability to achieve its NDC. And so this is something that's new and is very important and will take resources and capacity and time. And so Karen later is going to be talking about capacity issues. So just to conclude, as Luca has shown, coordination among actors will be needed to ensure that a possible transition from CDM to Article 6.4 is efficient. This can be done in different ways. If you look at the paper, we have suggestions on how this can be done in more efficient ways. There's a new context now compared to the CDM and because of the NDCs. And so this is an opportunity for the host party to provide changes to their domestic procedure for activity approval as well as credit authorization, and on top of any criteria that are agreed internationally, as well as to update or put in place new domestic criteria for Article 6.4 participation. So, for example, are they going to focus Article 6.4 activities in certain sectors? Are they going to require linkages with SDGs? There are many things that could be thought about that some countries have done under the CDM, not all countries. Cost floors is another one. So a lot of work is needed, but countries aren't starting from scratch. Many countries already have a lot of this in place from the CDM, and the majority of work can start in advance of agreement on the Article 6 rules, modalities and procedures. But one thing that is new is this needing to assess the credit transfer liabilities. So that's really new and really important. So in terms of how any transition from CDM could occur, there's a trade-off, as Luca has shown, between the resource needs and the compatibility with parts of the Paris decision that focus on real, measurable and verifiable and additional emission reductions. So thank you very much. If you can contact us if you would like more information or download the paper from the website attached. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Jane and Luca for this presentation, and I'm sure everyone can get more information from the paper that you've already made available online, so you can get more there. We have online Harry Fernoff from New Climate Institute that will also present. So we have slides from you, Harry, if we can get those up on the screen. Yes, very good. And either Karen or you can switch the slides. Yes. Harry, over to you. Welcome to this online hybrid event.
Thank you very much, and hello, everyone. So I'm going to present some analysis of policy options still under consideration, as Luca mentioned earlier, for Article 6 that we published earlier this year. The work was carried out by a team at 3 research institutes, at Climate Analytics, at ERCO Institute, and New Climate Institute, where I'm based. And the work was done on behalf of the LDC group to help inform their understanding of the potential implications of different decisions for international carbon markets under the Paris Agreement. The next slide. So we explore the impacts of different rules or decisions for 3 key unresolved elements of the Article 6 puzzle, let's say. And achieving an overall mitigation of global emissions, or OMGE, as it's abbreviated, through the use of international markets, delivering a share of proceeds to support adaptation, or SOP, and the potential transition of elements of the CDM into the Paris era. So looking at both the transition of CERs, units reflecting historical emission reductions, as well as the transition of CDM activities that might register with the Article 6.4 mechanism and continue issuing credits for emission reductions from the start of this year. And we look at 4 categories of impact. So the impact on global GHG emissions and the associated temperature goals of the Paris Agreement. We look at the impact on available funding for adaptation initiatives. We look at implications for the carbon credit market, so looking at price, quantity, market revenue. And we looked at some of the implications for certain key stakeholders to the market, including project owners, credit buyers. The next slide. So our quantitative analysis uses a supply and demand economic framework, which we set up as a relatively simplified representation of the market to inform what happens under different market conditions, so such as different levels of SOP or OMGE, or the transition of different volumes of credits from historic CDM projects. And these policy decisions primarily impact the volume of credits that could supply the market at different price levels. And they all influence the sort of the shape of the supply curve in slightly different ways. And that's why it's important and interesting to consider these options, not just in isolation, but also in combination with each other. And we also developed an informed, albeit highly uncertain, estimate of the demand for credits. So both for use towards NDC targets, as well as for alternative uses such as compliance with CORSIA, the scheme to regulate international aviation emissions, as well as the voluntary market. In the next slides, we analyze scenarios including cancelling 2, 10, or 30% of issued credits in order to deliver an overall mitigation of global emissions, as well as options for allocating either 2% or 5% of issued credits to the adaptation fund. We can go back a slide, but as a share of proceeds. And these result in 6 possible sort of different combinations between these options. And we find that global abatement increases in all of the OMGE and SOP policy combination scenarios. higher OMGE levels are the key driver of further abatement because units are actually cancelled. This raises the price of credits and it drives further abatement both in buying countries. They have a higher incentive to deliver further emission reductions at home, as well as to a lesser extent in selling countries or host countries. And 5% levels of SOP would channel materially more finance towards adaptation initiatives than a 2% level. And in fact, higher levels of OMGE serve to complement or boost this adaptation funding for a given SOP percentage, primarily because they raise the credit price and therefore the value that the adaptation fund can monetize the credits at. Go to the next slide. There's perhaps too much information to digest in 30 seconds or so, but here we show a bit more depth on the implications of these different policy combinations for market indicators, emissions in buyer and seller countries, and for certain stakeholders to the market. Perhaps to highlight a couple of things. So credit prices, that's at the top of this chart in the middle, rise with increasing OMG and SOP levels. And this, to some extent, erodes buyer savings, so credit buyer savings from the use of markets, and it incentivizes increasing domestic emission reductions within buyer countries. Overall, in our representation of the market revenues, they tend to increase with higher OMG and SOP, and project owner profits, so those of project developers, remain relatively unaffected across all of the policy options we considered. In the next slides, we also analyze the implications of any potential transition of CERs. So these credits reflecting historic emission reductions delivered in the period up to the end of last year, the end of 2020, for use towards NDCs. And this would effectively introduce low-cost credits into the market and displace the potential supply from new emission reduction activities. So on the topic of CER transition, it's fairly clear that any decision made that facilitates the use of CERs towards NDC targets will increase global GHG emissions. So purchasing these credits for historic actions, by definition, does not incentivize any further emission reductions because they've either occurred or they haven't. And allowing the transition of CERs, so we find from CDM projects registered since the beginning of 2016, could add approximately 50 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalent units to the atmosphere. And extending this vintage cutoff, as proposed by some, to projects registered since the beginning of 2013 could add on the order of 300 megatons. And it's not shown actually here on these slides, but we estimate that an unrestricted transition of CERs could mean on the order of 4 billion credits or 4 gigatons of hot air that could be transferred into the Paris era. And these charts, the chart on the right shows that whilst the limited number of project owners may gain from this, and that really depends on the market dynamics, it's very clear that the climate certainly would not, and nor would it send a strong signal to those looking to invest in new emission reduction activities. And in the next slide, we look at the implications of allowing full or partial transition of CDM activities. So what Luca and Jane were talking about previously. So looking at the transition to register with the new Article 6.4 mechanisms and issue credits for emission reductions during the current decade. What's important to note here is a small fraction of existing CDM projects may continue to depend on credit revenues to deliver abatement, so-called vulnerable activities. And supporting these activities can enable emission reductions that would not otherwise occur. However, any activity transition that allows non-vulnerable projects to continue issuing credits for emission reductions post-2020 is either likely to raise global emissions or undermine the ability of selling countries or host countries to achieve their targets. So there are two kind of broad scenarios here, but if host countries have ambitious NDCs and apply corresponding adjustments, so accounting adjustments, transitioning non-vulnerable projects can undermine their ambition because they'll need to seek out more challenging and likely more costly abatement options to reach effectively the same target. And for those countries that have weaker NDCs or for whatever reason might not apply corresponding adjustments, transitioning non-vulnerable projects will increase global emissions. We find that if a third of all CDM activities were to transition to the new 6.4 mechanism, global emissions may rise on the order of 800 megatons of carbon dioxide and critically dampen market signals for new investments. Finally, on the last slide, so we show, this chart shows the full range of combinations that we looked at in our research. Ideally, I would suggest digested outside of this short presentation, but to highlight that the best outcomes for the design and use of markets under Article 6 that we find for driving emission reductions are where, one, there is no transition of historic CDM units. It's clear this risks displacing new and urgent mitigation action. Two, that that the transition of activities is either limited to truly vulnerable activities, or there's no transition of activities whatsoever. And cancelling 30% of issued credits for OMGE, so to deliver an overall mitigation of global emissions, can help Article 6 serve its stated aim in the Paris Agreement text as a mechanism to facilitate raising ambition. And these cases or these scenarios can lead to avoided damages on the order of 45 to 180 or 81 billion US dollars, depending on the valuation of damages from carbon emissions that you select. And perhaps a last note that's certainly relevant in the context of ongoing deliberations is that applying OMGE and SOP to credits under Article 6.4 without applying the same levels to transfers under Article 6.2 can effectively shift demand to the latter, to 6.2, and may jeopardize any of the mitigation and adaptation funding benefits that we find. Thank you. And yeah, this final slide just shows links to the work for those more interested in following up.
Thank you very much, Harry, for this presentation. And now we have the last presentation from Karen Olsen from my own organization, UNEP DTU Partnership. Go ahead, Karen.
Thank you. If I can also have slides. Here they are. I will present a program for capacity building called Supporting Preparedness for Article 6 Cooperation, in short SPARC, for high ambition NDC implementation. And it's a little bit early because we are not launching this program yet. It's an introduction today on behalf of the German government, the International Climate Initiative, who's funding it, and the partners that you see here. So Susanna and myself are from UNEP DTU, and the consortium is led by GGGI, together with 3 other partners. I'll present them later. But the introduction tells what the program is about, a short description, some examples of what the in-country activities are, and the organization and time plan. It's a 20 million euro program, and we hope to launch it as soon as it gets approved. It's at final approval stages. But the program will work with 4 countries, 4 partner countries that have been selected for their willingness to cooperate using Article 6 approaches to enable ambition raising in their NDC implementation. And these countries are Thailand, Colombia, Pakistan, and Zambia. You may see that there is a regional spread. So they accept Pakistan and Thailand from the Asian region, but that's also very big. And then we have Zambia for Africa and Colombia for Latin America. In country, the target groups are the governments as the key political partners. We also will work with research institutions, such as UNIMDTU as a university, and take a research-based approach. We will also work with multiple other national institutions, development environment, climate change, private sector, national finance institutions, a range of different organizations involved in carbon markets with the purpose of building capacity, which is the main focus. So in other words, the objective here is to, and this is related to the impacts, that through pilots in the countries, we will engage private sector, taking a research-based approach to develop tools and approaches for markets to help with NDC compliance, raising ambition, and also have positive sustainability impacts. Activities in the project are split into work packages. We have 4 work packages for each of the countries in work package 3, and then we have 2 centrally managed work packages. The first is a high ambition community of practice, where the intention is to embed knowledge development in countries and loop back to lessons learned regionally, involving the research institutions and other countries in the region, taking a regional approach, working with the regional collaborating centers under the Secretariat. And in the work package 2, we will develop a toolbox of technical support, guidance, tools, strategies, structures that supporting countries to develop strategies, structures and approaches, institutional development, methods to integrate carbon markets with other pricing mechanisms, and have the generic toolbox adapted and applied country-specific, which is what the in-country implementation is about. And this will be discussed and agreed with governments. It is high level at proposal stage, but we will also have an inception phase to go into detail with plans, ensuring country ownership. So an example from Pakistan, what the project will do is that we work with the political partners, the lead government partner, which is Ministry of Climate Change in Pakistan, but also the National Committee on Establishment of Carbon Markets. We seek synergies with other relevant projects and initiatives and partnerships. Pakistan just updated its NDC prior to Glasgow and have come out with new targets, conditional target of 50% reductions by 2030, 15% by own means, and also using Article 6 market and non-market approaches to help achieve their NDC targets. And then there are a number of other activities here that we will build on, collaborate with, to do activities here, and the outputs that pilots are very important for Pakistan. We will do at least 3 targeting the high priority sectors. We will also help develop planning documents for medium and long-term emission planning and set up institutional arrangements to trade ITMOs using the guidance and tools that are developed. So the setup in terms of organization is GGGI as lead, and we all have as partners different responsibilities and tasks, also in relation to the countries. But exactly who gets contracted to do what. It's competitive process in countries. But the time plan overall is that we will launch early next year as soon as approval is confirmed, after review, and when ready. And then it's a 5-year program, scheduled to start early next year and to end in early 2027. Thanks.
Thank you, Karen. Considering that 87% of all NDCs mention Article 6 market mechanisms as a potential means that will be used, capacity building is certainly needed. And this is also my question to you, Gabru Endelov, representing the LDC chair group. How do you see, from your experience and maybe also discussions with the LDC chair from a least developed country perspective, what are the most important aspects for capacity building that are needed in order to enable the Article 6.4 mechanism to be operational? I think we need to turn on the mic for, okay. Please go ahead. You just speak.
Okay. Thank you. It's fine? Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Actually, I have different hats. I'm representing the chair, and I'm also part of this. I'm also working for GGI, so that means I'll be directly or indirectly engaged in this capacity development program. But I do feel that it's timely to think of really preparing for the implementation of Article 6. And it's encouraging when you look at the negotiating environment there have been proposals from parties to incorporate capacity building component in it, which is a prerequisite. And I do believe that part of the reason for not being able to make use of CDM for most of developing countries like LDCs is the issue of capacity. I no more agree with we don't have capacity, but our capacity was not in a way tailored toward this kind of activities. So in this regard, I think this will be an opportunity for us to be early movers for engaging in carbon markets. But the key message that we need to take into consideration when realizing this project is it is going to take us 5 years for 4 countries. But in terms of timing, if we don't need to really do the business as usual way of doing things, so we need to move faster. Doesn't mean that we should not really do it for the sake of doing it across a number of developing countries, but we do need to do it in a business as usual way. And we need to move from capacity building to capacity development. Because if you look at most of developing countries, they have universities, research centers. It's good that you have to start with research centers and universities as well. It's a matter of mainstreaming the tools, the guidelines that are to be developed to be integrated into the curriculum of the universities or research centers. Once you do that, it could be easier to scale it out, for instance, from Zambia easily to Malawi, easily to Zimbabwe, to the neighboring countries. So I think we need to look at it in a way that we build capacity in a more sustainable way. And to be more, the pace of work needs to be, we are going to, if it's 5 years, 2027, then it will be like almost half of the NDC commitment. So I think in terms of timing, we need to move faster. And in terms of quality and the approach that we are going to follow, we need to be prepared to do it in a way that it contributes to sustainable way of building capacity. And when we think of using consultants, this fly-in, fly-out approach, I think that has been commented a lot in terms of capacity building for developing countries. Normally, the business as usual way of building capacity is having 3-day workshop, then ticking the box. That way will keep us in a vicious circle of problem not being resolved for a long time. So that's the message which I want to deliver. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we had another question. I think that our climate negotiator from Chile has arrived. So very good that you could join us. So the question is really to also ask from a country perspective, what are the most important considerations to transition from CDM activities to implementation of the Article 6.4 mechanism.
Yeah.
So representative from Chile, go ahead.
Thank you. Is it working?
Yes, it's working and we can hear you. And if you wish to take this floor up there, please go ahead. I know you're far away, but we are all focused on you then.
Right. Well, I think I share the opinion of Sonam in the sense that capacity building in these negotiations particularly has been brought out by many parties from the developing world. And I think it's essential. When you think about the rules, if we manage to get the rules in place, adopted here, you won't have any project activity, right away. So you need a lot of capacities in terms of not just putting in place a project, but all the decision-making process that you need, especially, well, you mentioned 6.4, but especially on 6.2. Because you will need a lot of decisions to make, authorization, issuance, all the project cycle on 6.2. But I would say it's the same thing on 6.4. When you look at the negotiations and you're looking at the I would say more relevant role that host parties will have in terms of approving projects, in terms of even saying something about baselines, how this relates to the NDC, all this we didn't have it before with the CDM. So that was done. We didn't have any commitments to achieve. So that was really an interaction between the project developer and the buyers. So the government just gave a letter of approval, and that was it. But now it's different. Now it's different because we have an NDC. So if we engage in Article 6.2 or 6.4, a lot of decisions will need to be made, and I think we all need those capacities, not just the LDCs, but I would say many countries that want to use Article 6 will need to have a lot of capacity building. I don't know. I imagine in my head a lot of things, but I guess what is more relevant is how this activity relates to the NDC, and that's key. And I don't think we in Chile have the capacity to make those decisions now. We're still approving some small CDM projects. We're still approving JCM projects. Those are small projects, but if you bundle them together, maybe they will reach meaningful emission reductions, which we are not linking those to the NDC, and we need to do that. So, yeah.
Thank you very much for this intervention, also from Chile. I think we would like to open the floor for comments, discussions, or questions, or even online if there are any questions. Anyone from the room here that would like to either ask a question of one of the panelists or comment on something? Any reflections from our panelists that you would like to come? Gibru, you have something, or?
Yeah, just others come in. Just let me reflect on the second presentation, especially on the work done by Harry and his team. Just a simple example. 2 years back in Madrid, when we were negotiating, we couldn't agree on numbers on share of proceeds, OMG, and transfer of units versus activities. So we end up, we came up with numbers without good justification. So the LDC group requested for, can we come up with evidence it should be evidence-based negotiation rather than just bringing in numbers. So as you can see, the numbers, the share of proceeds and the OMG numbers, which has been generated through this research, has been very useful for us LDCs to put it as our position. Just I would like to highlight that. So, and in terms of transfer of activities versus units, I mean, you saw the environment today. So we were more progressive in terms of bringing in transfer of activities than units, but it was taken as a grant, you know. So they kept it as it is, and then they put other options for transfer of units. So, but I think it could be helpful to transfer activities which really fulfill certain criteria. But when I look at your criteria, they are more of procedural rather than really looking the quality of the project, integrity of the environment, because overall key principle which you only follow is the quality of the project, which will contribute toward the integrity of the environment. Let me stop you. Thank you.
Yes, I think that's a very good point, that of course, no matter what mechanisms are set up, I mean, we want good carbon emissions reductions projects to take place. This is the whole purpose of it, so I fully agree. Any other comments, reflections?
Can I ask a question?
Yes. Yes, go ahead.
Sorry, question to the panel.
Yeah, okay. Go ahead.
So I was wondering what happens in between. I mean, we don't have any 6.4 yet in place, not 6.2. So what happens in between? So that's a good question because, I mean, I don't know, 2 or 3 years probably to have, 6.4 activities in place, running. So my question would be, what's your take on these temporary measures that the CMP, the COP, I mean the authority of the Kyoto Protocol given to the CDM Executive Board did, in order to try to keep this going in parallel to having these decisions on 6.4. So I wanted to ask you that. I'm sorry because I jumped in before you.
Okay, if we could have a quick answer from one of the panelists to this intervention. Yes, Luca?
That's a very good question, Juan Pedro, thanks. I think a lot depends, of course, on what is going to be decided here at COP. We've seen that there are already some pilots of Article 6 that are being piloted around the world, especially I know that some countries are more active than others, like Switzerland, for instance, with bilateral agreements. And so for 6.2, I think it really depends on the bilateral accords that will be from country to country. For 6.4 instead, as Jane said, there are already some activities that could start already now, because we know that there is a lot of work to do, especially from the host parties' point of view, and also some work that could be done by SAPSTA and other bodies when they are established. But then for capacity building, that's a very good question. It really depends on when there is going to be an agreement on methodologies, the environmental integrity that he was mentioning, the environmental integrity of this. So I think it will be a very good space to watch in the future. So certain elements probably could start the capacity building components already. Others probably would have to wait until we have a decision on that.
Thank you. There's a question from the audience, please.
Yeah, quick comment and then a question,
Go ahead.
if you allow. So my name is Stefan Hoch from Perspectives. I just wanted to say that when we talk about CDM transition, I think, yes, the distinction between units and activities is crucial, but we also need to think beyond that in terms of, for instance, the mechanism infrastructure, where a lot of the functionality of the mechanism is currently provided by the Secretariat, for instance. And as you said, there will be a gap before we have that under 6.4. So just to say, we need to look at this very holistically. And then, Gebru, to you, I would have the question, we heard in the presentation from Luca and Jane that, for instance, host country would define such criteria. And I wonder how you see that now from a host country perspective now, maybe switching hats a bit more, looking into the Ethiopian context. Do you think countries should decide these criteria, or do you think it should be the CMA, that sets this eligibility? And also, how do you see the role of differentiation? We had to spend a lot of time, a lot of capacity building also for the CDM in Africa specifically, but also other regions that didn't participate so much. So how can we ensure that we don't lose all of these investments in terms of time and money, so that we don't sort of lose that as kind of collateral damage between, the blocks that have the huge portfolios that maybe are more, let's say, at the center of the debate in the negotiation rooms. Thank you.
Well, I think I believe that the CDM experience is an expensive way of learning, but still there are a lot of things which we need to adjust or move it as it is. In terms of the infrastructure, it's very clear. I think not only from the time perspective, even from the if you look at all the available infrastructures, much of it, I believe, will be migrated to the new region. So, including the infrastructure in the host countries, if there's any. But I'm not sure. That's a challenge. But we need to learn from the CDM. Does mean that we need to take all the good things, and we need to adjust the missing component. So, in that regard, really, host country kind of a bottom-up process, it could have been nice if it was more of bilateral kind of thing, But for the multilateral setting, it may need a kind of top-down guidance from the CMA, a minimum requirement. Then you can add, but at least there should be something in common for the whole host countries. Yeah.
Thank you. I think Jane wanted to comment.
Thanks. Can you hear me? So just to clarify that I wasn't suggesting that it should be just the host countries that set the criteria, but because agreement here is by consensus, any agreement here might not be as stringent as some host parties might like, and because there's an impact on transferring credits on them achieving their NDC, it may be possible, or it may be envisageable, that some host countries might want to extend, make more stringent methodologies, or, as I said, have other criteria, like in the CDM, China had a price floor. Early projects in India, it was a sort of like a share of the proceeds. The government decided to take some money and transfer it to the local community. So there are various things that countries could decide, but this would be on top of what is already agreed at the international level. That was our thinking.
Thank you. I think we have only time for one question. So there's one at the back there. Go ahead. There's a microphone being passed on.
Thank you. Simon Evans from Carbon Brief. I was interested to see the findings from the new climate research on the impact of different choices on share of proceeds, OMG and so on. But obviously some parties, some negotiating blocs have strong opposition to any automatic cancellation. And I wonder if the panelists could just comment on what they think might ultimately get agreed.
Does anyone want to comment or answer that?
Perhaps Harry, if he's here.
Yeah, Harry, sorry, you're on the line. Would you care to comment, Harry?
I'm not sure I can provide a very definitive answer.
No, but quick.
These are, of course, the key questions, and we've set out this research to help inform that. And there are obviously a number of key trade-offs throughout the Article 6 kind of jigsaw that are going on at the moment. I don't think we have an answer, no, and probably there will be some form of compromise trading off amongst these various different elements. And I think my understanding at the moment is there are quite strong different views amongst the different parties that make a landing position extremely challenging.
Thank you. I don't know if you can give a 30-second answer to the written question online, Karen, on the comments to the project, Spark project, whether ITMOs could be interesting 5 years after the pilots. Karen, very quickly.
Well, we would be able to sell as soon as the units are generated. We don't have to wait 5 years if the credits are ready earlier. And I think some of the countries in Pakistan, for instance, this is very high priority. And building on the CDM experience which is there, I don't expect it will take 5 years before we get credits for sale. And in terms of who will buy them, we see currently the highest demand in the voluntary market and a heated discussion on whether corresponding adjustments are needed or not. So as soon as this is possible, I hope demand will be there for the high integrity units with corresponding adjustments. And we will certainly contribute to enable that with capacity building.
Thank you very much. I think that probably concludes our session today. So I would like to thank all the speakers, discussants for this insightful consideration. It's certainly very complicated, but this mechanism 6.4 is certainly at the heart of some of the unresolved crunch issues. But as Karen said, there is probably a strong momentum this time around, so hopefully we will conclude the negotiations this year. And I would also like to thank everyone here in the audience and online, and for our organizers. And it's certainly an area where there's a lot of capacity building needed for every actor if we will get a final agreement in COP26. So thank you very much. Thank you.